Do you talk to it and say like, "You filthy scoundrel" or anything?
Scoundrel.
No, but I did say some expletives when I was doing it. I was doing an interview last week or something, and it decided to update, and apparently like Windows 10 just sucks, and I had no idea. Just forced an update in the middle of my interview. It was like, oh, cool.
People don't use the word scoundrel anymore. They should.
We should
bring that back. I want to bring that back and also say what gives.
Say what gives.
Yeah, like if someone's having a bad day or if they give you a cross look, you say what gives.
I'll start incorporating it like immediately.
Yeah. Meet the Pressers with Matt Mallory and Klint Necron. Brought to you by Public Safety and Education and the Trigger Pressers Union. And now, your hosts.
This episode is brought to you by Mountain Man Medical. The right medical training and gear should be accessible to every American. Mantis. Mantis X helps shooters suck less. Meet the Pressers is sponsored by Next Level Training, Saber Red, Cutting Edge Bullets, the USCCA, ASP, Common Sense Self-Defense, and T1 Ammunition. Meet the Pressers is also generously supported by other fine companies, ranges, and our Patreon members. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Meet the Pressers. My name is Klint Necron, and this is my esteemed colleague, Matthew Mallory. Meet the Pressers is a safe place for trigger pressers to gather and talk about guns, gear, gadgets, training, political activism, religion, and some gun nerd stuff, talking about different types of firearms and the history behind them. Today, we have a very special guest I'm excited for Matt to introduce.
Yes, Clint, I can do that. Ashley Hlebinsky, curator of the Cody Museum. She's a producer and an actress, Midway USA Gun Stories, Brothers in Arms, Master of Arms, and she also works for the DC Project and Firearms Policy Coalition. We are tickled pink or red to have you here today, ma'am.
I have pink on with my red hair. So.
You're matching.
Yes. Well, I have to correct like all of that, but
please do.
I'm not curator of the Cody Firearms Museum anymore. I'm the curator emerita. I stepped back from day-to-day working with the museum back in July. So my awesome assistant curator, Danny, is now the curator there. So I'm still involved, but I'm not, I don't have to deal with bureaucracy anymore, which is a lot of fun.
That's good.
And I'm not an actress. IMDb just says I am.
So how did you get into this world and into the museum industry specifically too?
So it's not like a normal route. I am from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So people assume that I grew up around firearms. I did not. I didn't even know that there was a rifle range in my high school until like later. And I guess it was really quiet. They used suppressors. But so I was someone that I grew up, I had a lot of surgeries growing up. I was in a wheelchair for part of middle school. So I wanted to be a doctor. That was like my pathway. And I was always interested in the history of medicine, but I guess I never really connected that people worked at historic sites and museums until I got to college. And I was going to college for the sciences so that I could go to medical school. And then I went on a Civil War medicine tour at Gettysburg, which is about 3 hours from where I grew up. And they were talking about how the advancements of weapons technology altered medical technology on the battlefield, specifically talking about the Minier ball. So the first really adopted conically shaped cartridge, and how the conical shape to the bullet actually caused more shattering of bone, which changed how the medical profession had to operate on the battlefield. Fast forward, I went to Colonial Williamsburg, heard a similar spiel, but different technology. And I was like, this is really interesting. I'd never thought about that. So I changed my major to history, and my mom, the physics teacher, told me that I better have a job when I graduated, because history majors have a notorious reputation for not having jobs in our field. And I started doing internships. So I'll never forget this. I had just gotten my wisdom teeth out, and I had worked a full shift at DSW, the shoe store. So I was dressed real, professional. And my mom was like, "Hey, there's this room reopening in Carnegie, Pennsylvania, and we should go check it out because it was a Civil War room that was basically like locked like a time capsule." And she's like, "You should go check it out. You're getting into history and, firearms and that kind of thing." And so we went, and they were packing stuff up at that point. And there was a man that looked like he stepped out of the Civil War, and he was packing up a bunch of firearms. And I was like, "Oh, is that a Spencer rifle?" Like the 5 things I knew about guns. And he turned around and looked at me and was like, I was very blonde. And he was like, "Yes, it is." And so we started talking, and he was actually the curator of the Soldiers and Sailors Museum in Oakland on the University of Pittsburgh campus. And he invited me to come down and interview. They had actually already filled their intern spot for the summer, but they added one for me. And so that summer, I basically had never held a gun before in my life. I had to identify over 200 different types of guns, what was modified with them, what they were, all of the cataloging information. And I just got hooked on it. And there was a gun on display there that a Civil War soldier had hand carved every battle that he fought in into the stock.
Cool.
Wow.
And and so that was for me, an eye-opening moment, because I was so interested in the technology, but I was like, man, this is really, a story about people. Yeah. There's a lot more social stuff going on here. And so after that, I did everything I could to learn about firearms. I learned how to shoot modern guns, historic guns, studied them in books, got internships wherever I could. That's where I ended up at the Smithsonian for 3 years, went to graduate school, tried to study firearms. That's its own story. But I basically ended up studying the perception of guns in culture, including armed feminism and leftist firearms activism from the 60s and 70s.
Wow.
Fascinating topic, very relevant today.
Yeah.
And so, I just got hooked, and I started going out to Cody on a research fellowship when I was in between my senior year of college and my first year of grad school. And then I never left. And 10 years later, here I am.
A Bolshevik socialist in Cody, Wyoming.
Yeah. Oh, I've been called a socialist a lot.
Really?
Yeah, I get called it all the time because our museum is a historical museum. So we talk about firearms, good, bad, and indifferent. And the old museum was just kind of guns on display with not a lot of historical context. Now we have 1,000 more guns on display. You're welcome, angry gun people. But because we do talk about, social history, and we talk about cultural history, there are some like, and the numbers I can count on, both my hands, and that's it. But there are some hardcore older gun guys that didn't want it that way. So, we're socialists. We get called it all the time.
So you mean they want you to rewrite history?
They don't want me to write history at all, I guess.
Or that.
And then the one thing that ended up being really fascinating was when we reopened the museum, we included, I don't know if you guys saw this, but the Time Magazine mural that was from 2018. It was JR is a photographer that focuses on social issues, and so they did this mural that was 250 people equally represented across the gun debate. So we don't get into politics with our, with the museum because we're a nonprofit. And so, we thought it was great because I don't know if you've had Di Muller on the show, but Di she was the pro-gun spokesperson for it. And Di was in it, Gina Roberts, everybody I know, Robin Sandoval, so many people were a part of that mural, and everybody, including the NRA, who declined to participate, but then later said, they had an article called About Time, and everybody thought it was just this really great, fair representation of the entire debate. And so we put it up, and there was a few people who were like, rah, politics, and we're like, it's art, you're supposed to feel something. And it's a fascinating mural, but 2 years ago when we opened the museum, it was a very different world than where we are this summer. And so there's 2 different representations of BLM in that mural, and which is actually kind of fascinating because one representation, they're not holding guns, and then the other they are. And so there's Black Lives Matter signs in the mural. And so people see that and automatically assume it's a strictly Black Lives Matter, we're, supporting it sign. And then they call my assistant, for now curator, I got to get used to that, and call him a Bolshevik.
Well, I mean, you look at the First Amendment and we all appreciate each other's ability to speak their mind. The Second Amendment's for everybody, no matter what your political leanings are.
Exactly.
If you are an American, then you have the right to keep and bear arms.
Yep.
But it's funny because I think people just like glance quickly and they see that and then they just, and it was funny because we had no concept until one day some guy came very angrily over to Danny. I'm just going to call him Danny. Just 5 years of calling him my assistant. Danny, and Danny was like, "Oh no," and he started screaming to him about it. I was still curator then. I was just out of town, luckily. And so we learned like, we're in for it this summer, I guess, with that mural. But every time someone complains, for the record, we keep it up longer.
So it'll be up there forever then, with the way our community complains.
Well,
Yep.
yeah.
Hi, this is Luke Negron, your congressional nominee for PA 18, Pittsburgh and the South Hills. I will always defend your right to self-defense as is lawfully provided under our nation's great Second Amendment. You are watching Meet the Pressers with Matt Mallory and Klint Macro.
Meet the Pressers.
What's on the horizon next? Any other shows, movies?
Yeah. So movies. I'm not an actress. We already covered that.
Just putting it out there. Just want to see. You got all these credits.
Yeah. Nobody wants to see that. Lots of stuff. So when I became curator of the Cody Firearms Museum, one thing that I worked on a lot was an aggressive kind of PR campaign for the museum because it had kind of gotten stale and a lot of people didn't know who we were. And as a result of that, I ended up starting a consulting business that the museum supported me doing as well, as long as I disclosed what I was working on, because I found that there were a lot of avenues for history in the gun world, but then also there were a lot of museums with guns in them, but very few people who were trained in museums and firearms. Usually like someone who just really likes guns, who's like on staff as like a janitor or like the security guard or something, ends up helping with the firearms collection. But, there's a lot of things to be mindful of when you've got firearms in your museum, especially if you're a non-government museum, because you're bound by all gun laws. And so I started consulting for other museums and doing workshops and coming in as guest curator and working with their collections. And then that started growing into doing, I started getting calls. I think Tom Gresham was the first one that called for his TV show. He learned early, girls and guns, it's a thing.
It's a popular thing.
Yeah.
So as I did more and more, I guess my Google ability got better because other production companies started calling me to do different documentaries and that kind of thing. So I had a full-fledged consulting business when I left Cody. And I always said I wouldn't leave Cody until I could, basically transition, and it wasn't much of a change. So that was, now. And so I am consulting. Right now, the museum world's a little rough because of COVID. Like a lot of museums are furloughing people. And but the one that I work with a lot and will be again come January is the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. I will be procuring items for the mob. I like to tell people. So I work.
You have to transport them in a paper bag.
Yes, obviously, with my moonshine, because they have their own moonshining operation in the basement, which is a true story. So I'll be I work with museums, but then I also work with gun companies on, like I said, civil and sometimes I work with the government on criminal cases. But I'm doing a lot for Firearms Policy Coalition. I worked for their law firms. I filed a declaration in support of the California assault weapons ban injunction. And then I also filed a declaration in support of, I'm going to butcher the last name, but it's Gaides, the bump stock case. And so I've been doing a lot of court cases. I just helped to cast a new gun show, which I can't really say other than I helped to cast a gun show. We've got Gun Stories will be premiering. They're moving it, I think, to January. So I'll be filming for that probably pretty soon. And and that's fun because I just get to sit down and they interview me for 2 hours on all the subjects, and then I leave, which is pretty nice.
It's pretty interesting. I love how the success story that's happened for you. You just put your mind to it, right?
Yeah.
You said yourself that you didn't really know much about guns, had never touched a gun, but you just got just immersed yourself in it and you learned it and you wanted it and you wanted it bad enough, and it's a success. That's amazing. That's the American story, right?
Yeah, it's another amazing example where you went on a path and then all of a sudden a door was dropped in front of you. Like, oh, let me go through that door. And here you are, like years later.
Right. Sometimes I'm like, should I have just been a doctor? This would have been a lot less dramatic.
You'd be able to wear one of those reflector things on your head, and you'd have a nice white lab coat.
Yeah, it'd be cool.
Hello, my name is Klint Macro, founder of the Trigger Pressers Union. I'm very honored to be among the 30 speakers who are going to speak at the virtual rally that's taking place October 24th. I think it's a wonderful thing that so many Americans are realizing what the Second Amendment means to them. There are millions of people who were not exercising their Second Amendment rights 6 months ago that are now, and I welcome you all into the fold. It's important to recognize that as Americans, we have many rights. Some people exercise them, some people don't, but those rights are there for us when we need them. They need to be protected. So as we move into this election season, my best advice is to make sure that you vet the candidates that you're voting for. Make sure that they will protect your individual rights and liberties, most chiefly your right to defend yourselves and those that you love. So join me on October 24th, 2020 as we have the virtual rally, and we'll see you there.
I get a lot of interviews asking about my gender. But the one thing that I found is that being a woman might have helped open some doors initially, especially in the TV world. Mm-hmm. But the thing about what I kind of went through was that you might have gotten some doors open, but if you didn't know what the hell you were talking about, it would shut even harder.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Back up. And so, it's been kind of a stressful ride. I have to say, I had a couple of people, at gun shows be like, you're a political appointment to the Cody Firearms Museum initially. But for, after people talk to me, usually, I don't know, maybe if I've been drinking, they don't talk to me. But, it's been pretty open-minded. I know some people in the gun industry in and of itself, sometimes talk about some of the problems that still exist within the gun world, but I think it's because I come kind of tangential to the industry. I've been pretty fortunate overall, which has been cool.
So have you found where you come from with the educational museum aspect of it? Has that helped in your pursuits with like DC Project when talking with legislators? Yes
and no. So I live in a difficult world, which is that I'm an academic, which is difficult in and of itself. Mm-hmm. And so I deal a lot and as a, I'm very fortunate because I actually deal a lot with pro and anti-gun people very, very regularly. And I get along with both great. I have very productive dialogues with both sides, probably more than most people. And so as a result, I just have developed I've developed a way to talk to people that don't necessarily agree with you and hear their side out. And honestly, when I started studying guns, I was a liberal Democrat as well. And, I get where a lot of people come from. There are people obviously out there, intentionally trying to be malicious, but then there are a lot of people who are just ignorant and don't know. Yeah. They think they know, but they don't know. And so I deal a lot with those people. But the other part of that is that because I, ran a museum for so long and we don't take sides in the museum, I don't necessarily discuss my political views publicly very often. And the reason for that is because that way it allows me to be able to talk to anybody, and they don't feel like, I'm coming to the equation with something, Right. And so the DC project is interesting for me because, it's the first time I've had to be like, yes, I am a gun owner, it was just so silly, right? But it's just, you just get into this mode of, being the academic. But I really enjoyed going and talking to legislators because I do come to it with a much different view. I have my personal journey as to why I carry a gun, which I don't talk about very often because I think a lot of people, have more convincing stories. But when I went to the DC project, I was coming from an academic background of, here's the deal. There is not a lot of academic scholarship on firearms, meaning that your researchers who are pulling stuff up, they're going to find dead ends. And when they don't find dead ends, the scholarship is often incredibly biased one way or the other. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that we fight in the academic world is a lot of the traditional academics that do end up writing about firearms, they don't know anything about what we call the material culture. So that's the museum artifact side of it. So they write these very big, kind of existential theory-based histories applying firearms into it, but they don't actually know how the firearms operate. And so their conclusions, in my opinion, might be different if they actually understood the material culture. There's a book out there that is like kind of the standard now academic book. It's called The Gunning of America by Pamela Hogg, and it's a piece of crap. Sorry, Pamela. It's beautifully written. It's fascinating, but it's not, she doesn't know anything like about guns, and the way she describes guns, it just doesn't it doesn't make sense. And so,
like a politician making a law about a gun that they have no clue about the guns.
Exactly. So that's, and that was a question that was asked to me on PBS last year, is do I get frustrated when people misuse terminology? And I said, yeah, it's not semantics. It's if you're going to write a law that is going to, where the words matter, you should understand those words before you pass the law. I'm not telling you to pass the law or not. I'm just telling you to understand the friggin' thing before you do it.
Yeah.
And so when we talked to the legislators, I was able to kind of explain, one, that your researchers are going to have issues because they're either going to get a sterile, gun collector, nuts and bolts guide to guns, or they're going to get, these very, political history oriented things by people who don't necessarily know about firearms. Right. And so we kind of talked about that. But then the other thing that I was on my soapbox was about museums and the fact that museums have to abide by gun laws, where in England, that's not the case. There's a firearms museum license, and you can, if you're a museum, you can collect whatever you want, regardless of what the civilian population, can collect. So when we talked about universal background checks with the legislators, I was like, hey, did you know that may massively impact the museum? And a lot of the Democratic politicians and their, staffers were like, we had no idea, and so it was a different angle than I think they're used to hearing. Yeah. And so it wasn't the emotional plea of, this affects me personally, but it was just, this affects an entire, industry that you support. And it's not political, I always say that's the least political policy I could possibly try to bring to the table, because if you hate guns, put them in a museum. If you love guns, preserve them in a museum. And
that's actually genius. Yeah.
It was actually, a lot of fun to be a part of it. And they actually had me speak at the rally, which was fun. Because I was like, what happens when a historian speaks at a rally is that everybody falls asleep, right?
I doubt that happened.
Yes, very much so.
Actually, it was fantastic. I made the conclusion, because the DC project is wonderful and nonpartisan, which is something that I really like, because as I said, when I first got interested in guns, I was a Democrat and all of my friends were Democrat gun owners. And I thought it was really interesting when I got more into the gun world, and that was perceived as an oxymoron. I'm actually writing an article for Recoil on that right now.
Being a Democrat doesn't mean anti-gun. At least it shouldn't anyhow.
It shouldn't, yeah.
Yeah, it shouldn't.
So I'm actually I just wrote a history for Recoil that I'm going to submit today, actually, on liberalism in guns and the two-party system in guns and when guns became partisan. So strongly partisan. And so I actually talked about women and guns, go figure, for the DC project. But it was fantastic because there was this group holding flags behind me and I didn't see them, and they had this cardboard thing that they had written something on, and I hadn't seen it until they were marching away, and I went, oh shit, because I started talking about women and guns, because women have been a part of firearms history forever, and very involved, and the gun industry marketed to women really, really early on, when the kind of modern consumerism came about. And so it's this fascinating history. But then I got into my armed feminists, who were extreme leftist activists, and the ending point of my little rally speech was the fact that most feminists today make fun of women gun owners for wanting to carry a gun, and most female gun owners scoff at feminism, but actually they have each other to thank for where we are today, because if it wasn't for the armed feminists fighting for self-defense, which is what they were doing back then, same rhetoric that refused to be a victim had 10 years later, you really have each other to thank for where you are. And the cardboard sign was the Second Amendment doing more for women than the entire feminist movement, and I was just like, ironic.
Be the first kid on your block to have your official issue Meet the Pressers logoed gear. Visit the Meet the Pressers merchandise page on ballisticink.com to get your high-quality, American-made Meet the Pressers shirts and hats.
Here's a question for you guys. Assault rifle, real or not?
Well,
It was propaganda from Hitler, Stormgewehr, right?
Well, it's still a real dumb. It's still okay. So here's the way I look at it.
an inanimate object can't assault people. That's how
Yes, and that's where I'm coming. So by definition, it is a real thing. It's a classification of firearms to, differentiate from other types of firearms. You can argue it's a useless term. You can argue it's a term that doesn't make sense, but it is in fact a definable term within our government. I think it's David Koppel that talks about that, which is that it is a real term. You can argue it's stupid, but you can't argue it's not real. And I say that because I get crucified on the internet every time I talk. I ingest call something an assault rifle, but I'm calling it that because it fits the definition, which is selective fire, intermediate cartridge, single soldier portable, detachable magazine, all that stuff. So it is definable. Unlike assault weapon, which is kind of like this. It's different depending on the legislation. I'm going to write an article for Firearms Policy Coalition about the origins of assault weapon because I want to know where the first time it was used.
Nice.
To try to get to the bottom of it. I did find there's a military term that used it for like some kind of device that you put on top or like you attach to the end of a gun. They called an assault weapon. So I'm really intrigued by that because it is such a amorphous blob of a term. But it is funny because when I did a thing for Recoil and I was holding a STG-44 and there's my dog. I was holding an STG-44 and I was like, today I'm going to talk about assault rifles. And I'm going to talk about one of the first. And I put the gun down and I picked up the Burton light machine rifle from the 19-teens that was developed by Frank Burton with Winchester, which fits the definition of an assault rifle decades prior to, the formal adoption of the terminology and the type of technology and all that stuff. And I, just was being funny. And like Dave Merrill from Recoil texted me, was like, holy crap, I have no idea that gun people don't know the difference between assault rifle and assault weapon. So there were some people mad about assault rifle, but 99% of the commenters on the Recoil Facebook page didn't know the difference between an assault weapon and an assault rifle. And these are gun people. And so they're like, assault rifle is a made up legislative term, and then they were like, and then they would interchangeably say assault weapon, assault rifle. And luckily enough people defended me that I didn't really have to get involved in the argument. They were like, no, assault rifle means this. And it was just this fascinating quagmire that I had no idea existed. And then when I did PBS, I was standing in front of a case of, it was a combination of modern guns. So there were some quote unquote assault rifles, and then there were some modern sporting rifles, and so it was a combination of things, but we were talking about the terminology assault rifle and assault weapon, and what I said was factually correct the way they edited it, because they obviously cut out a ton of stuff, but it was factually correct, but somebody got on me again because they didn't know the difference between assault weapon and an assault rifle. And it was funny because I'm used to the argument of people that don't like the term assault rifle but understand it's different from assault weapon, but man, I get beat up by people that have no idea in the gun world that these are two different meanings, which is fascinating.
In New York state legislation, it's assault weapon, but we got politicians walking around saying assault rifle, and or automatic rifle, and then I have to explain to them, no, it's armor light.
And I would venture a guess that those definitions vary state to state, region to region. I mean, even in Pennsylvania statutory law, there are two separate definitions for firearm. Let alone when you get into other nuanced items. This has been a great conversation, and I'd love for you to come back onto the show at some other time too. Before we close it up, could you just tell people how to follow you or check out websites, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. If you want to follow me, you get gun history, you get booze history, you get my food and my dog, and I'll get some selfies. I'm at That Lady Curator on Instagram, and I'm at official Ashley Hlebinsky on Facebook. Don't bother with my Twitter because I don't tweet. I have a Twitter, but you'll be very disappointed. And then if you want to check out the museum, I actually do all the social media for the museum as well, but you don't get dog pics. And that's at Cody Firearms Museum for Instagram and Facebook, and just at Cody Firearms on Twitter.
Well, it's a pleasure having you on the show. It's actually been a huge amount of fun for us, and I appreciate you coming on, and we'll hope to see you some other time.
Yeah, no, this has been a lot of fun.
All right. Thank
Stay
you for
safe.
coming on the show.
There's lots of sponsors that make this show possible, like Mountain Man Medical.
Check them out and give them your business.
This episode is brought to you by Mountain Man Medical. The right medical training and gear should be accessible to every American. Mantis. Mantis X helps shooters suck less. Meet the Pressers is sponsored by Next Level Training, Saber Red, Cutting Edge Bullets, the USCCA, ASP, Common Sense Self-Defense, and T1 Ammunition. Meet the Pressers is also generously supported by other fine companies, ranges, and our Patreon members. Thank you.
Thanks for watching or listening to our show.
Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share. Click that little bell thingy so you know when the next episode's uploaded. Support us on Patreon. Come to one of our classes. Host us to come to you and do one of our classes at your location.
And until next time.
Adieu.
Thank you for watching Meet the Pressers.